My coworker stole credit for my work for 3 years. During the promotion meeting, I asked one question that ended his career. The moment I raised my hand in that conference room, I watched the color drain from Graham Whitfield's face like someone had pulled a plug at the bottom of his skull. 11 executives sat around that mahogany table, their pens poised over notepads, their coffee cups steaming, and every single one of them was about to witness the most spectacular professional implosion in the history of Meridian Technologies. Graham stood at the front of the room, his PowerPoint frozen on slide 14, his $400 tie suddenly looking like a noose. He'd been mid-sentence, mid-lie, mid-theft of my intellectual property when I interrupted him with a question so simple that a first-year intern could have answered it. But Graham couldn't, because Graham had never done the work. I had. For 3 years, 8 months, and 19 days, I had been the ghost behind his glory. I'd watched him collect bonuses for my innovations, accept handshakes for my breakthroughs, and pocket promotions built on the foundation of my 60-hour weeks. And now, in front of the entire executive leadership team, I was about to ask him to explain the technical methodology behind the algorithm he was presenting as his crowning achievement. The algorithm I'd written in my apartment at 3 a.m. while he was at happy hour. The algorithm that had saved this company $4.2 million last quarter alone. The algorithm he couldn't explain if his life depended on it. I'd been a senior data analyst at Meridian Technologies for almost 4 years when everything finally came to a head. I joined the company fresh off my master's degree from Carnegie Mellon, bright-eyed and stupidly optimistic, convinced that talent and hard work would be rewarded in the corporate world. I was assigned to the predictive analytics division under the leadership of Graham Whitfield, a man I initially admired. He was charming in that effortless way that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. He had a firm handshake, an expensive watch, and a corner office with a view of the city skyline. He called me kiddo, in a way that felt paternal rather than condescending, and he promised to mentor me. "Stick with me, Mira," he said during my first week, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "I'll make sure the right people notice you." I believed him. God, I believed every word. What I didn't realize was that Graham Whitfield hadn't produced an original idea in over a decade. His entire career was built on the contributions of junior employees he systematically exploited and discarded. I was just the latest in a long line of victims, but I would be the last. Because unlike the others, I kept receipts. The first time Graham stole my work, I convinced myself it was a misunderstanding. I'd spent 3 weeks developing a predictive model for customer churn that reduced our forecast error by 18%. I documented everything meticulously, saved every version, and sent Graham a detailed report with my methodology, my code, and my recommendations. I was proud of that work. It was elegant, it was effective, it was mine. 2 days later, I sat in a department meeting and watched Graham present my model to our VP of Operations, Lorraine Hu, as if he'd built it himself. He didn't just take credit, he erased me entirely. "I've been working on this for about a month," he told Lorraine, clicking through slides that looked suspiciously similar to the ones I'd sent him. The breakthrough came when I realized we needed to weight recent transactions more heavily in the regression. That was my breakthrough. Those were my words. I sat in my chair, my stomach slowly turning to ice, and told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd forgotten to mention my contribution. Maybe he was planning to credit me later. Maybe I'd misunderstood the dynamics of how credit worked at this level. I waited for him to acknowledge me, to gesture in my direction, to say my name. He never did. After the meeting, I approached Graham in his office, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say a dozen times, trying to strike the balance between assertive and respectful. I didn't want to accuse him of anything. I just wanted clarity. "Hey, Graham," I said, hovering in his doorway. "Great presentation today. I noticed you presented the churn model. I just wanted to make sure, since I developed that methodology, that my contribution would be reflected in any documentation or recognition that comes from it." Graham looked up from his computer with an expression of such genuine confusion that I almost believed I was the one who'd made a mistake. "The churn model?" he said. "Mira, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but that model was based on a framework I've been developing for years. You helped with some of the data cleaning, sure, but the core innovation was mine." He said it so smoothly, so confidently, that for a moment I doubted my own memory. Had I misremembered my contribution? Had I overestimated my role? I stood there, mouth slightly open, unable to formulate a response. Graham smiled kindly and returned to his screen. "Keep up the good work, though. You're doing great." I walked back to my desk in a daze. That night, I went home and pulled up every email, every document, every version-controlled file that proved I'd built that model from scratch. The evidence was overwhelming. Graham hadn't contributed a single line of code, and yet somehow, he'd convinced me to doubt myself. The second theft was bolder. 6 months after the churn model incident, our division was tasked with developing an automated anomaly detection system for our fraud prevention unit. It was a massive project with a tight deadline, and Graham assigned the bulk of the technical work to me while he handled what he called stakeholder management. I worked nights and weekends for 2 months. I barely slept. I lost 8 pounds because I kept forgetting to eat. But I delivered a system that exceeded every benchmark we'd been given. It detected fraudulent transactions 340 milliseconds faster than our previous system and reduced false positives by 23%. The day before the final presentation to the C-suite, Graham called me into his office and told me I wouldn't be attending. "These executive meetings can be politically sensitive," he explained, leaning back in his leather chair. "I think it's better if I present on behalf of the team. Don't worry, I'll make sure your contributions are noted." They weren't noted. I know because I asked Lorraine, Hu's assistant, for a copy of the meeting minutes 3 weeks later. Graham's name appeared 11 times. Mine appeared 0. The project was attributed entirely to his visionary leadership. I received a form email thanking me for my support on the initiative. Graham received a $15,000 bonus and a glowing write-up in the company newsletter. By the end of my second year at Meridian, I'd learned to recognize the pattern. Graham would assign me the complex technical work that required genuine expertise. He'd maintain just enough involvement to claim oversight. And then he'd present the results to leadership as his own accomplishments, carefully scrubbing my name from every document, every presentation, every email chain that might reveal the truth. I started keeping a shadow archive. Every email I sent Graham, I blind copied to my personal account. Every document I created, I saved a time-stamped version to an encrypted cloud folder. Every meeting where he presented my work, I noted the date, the attendees, and the specific claims he made. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was overreacting. But something in my gut knew that eventually, I would need proof. What I didn't anticipate was how long I would have to wait, and I certainly didn't anticipate how far Graham would go to protect his stolen empire. The incident that nearly broke me happened 18 months into my tenure. I developed a machine learning model that could predict supply chain disruptions with remarkable accuracy. It was, without exaggeration, the best work I'd ever done. The model incorporated over 200 variables, used a novel ensemble approach I designed myself, and had been validated against 5 years of historical data with a prediction accuracy rate of 91%. When I presented it to Graham, his eyes lit up in a way that made my stomach clench. "This is incredible, Mira," he said, scrolling through my documentation. "This could save us millions." I knew what was coming. I'd seen that look before. But this time, something was different. This time, I decided to push back. "I'd like to present this one myself," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I think it would be good development experience for me, and it might help raise my visibility with the leadership team." Graham's smile flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into place. "I hear you," he said. "Let me see what I can arrange." What he arranged was a meeting with HR the following week, where I was informed that there had been concerns about my communication style and collaborative abilities. The HR representative, a nervous man named Douglas Park, couldn't tell me who had raised these concerns or provide any specific examples. He just suggested that I might benefit from a coaching program to help me become a better team player. I sat in that HR office, my face carefully neutral, while everything inside me screamed. I knew exactly who had raised those concerns. I knew exactly why. Graham was preemptively poisoning the well, creating a paper trail that would discredit me if I ever tried to expose him. I agreed to the coaching program because I didn't have a choice. I smiled and nodded and thanked Douglas for the feedback. And then I went home and cried until I couldn't breathe. I called my older sister, Adaora, that night. She'd been a corporate lawyer for 15 years before leaving to start her own firm, and she'd seen every variety of workplace manipulation imaginable. When I finished explaining the situation, she was quiet for a long moment. "Document everything," she finally said. "And I mean everything. Timestamps, witnesses, file metadata, version histories, and don't confront him again, Mira. Not until you have enough evidence to bury him." I took her advice. For the next 18 months, I became the most diligent archivist in corporate history. I recorded my screen during video calls where Graham discussed projects. I saved Slack messages with timestamps. I created detailed logs of every task I completed, every line of code I wrote, every analysis I produced. My shadow archive grew into a comprehensive dossier of systematic intellectual theft. The third major theft occurred during the summer of my third year. Meridian was developing a new pricing optimization platform, and Graham assigned me to lead the technical architecture while he handled, as always, the strategic vision. I built that platform from the ground up. I wrote over 30,000 lines of code. I designed the database schema, the API integrations, the machine learning pipeline that powered the optimization engine. I worked so many consecutive weekends that I forgot what Saturday mornings felt like. When the platform launched, it increased revenue by 12% in the first quarter. The CEO, Winston Aldridge, personally congratulated Graham in a company-wide email. "Graham's innovative approach to pricing intelligence represents the future of our competitive strategy," Winston wrote. "Please join me in recognizing his exceptional leadership." I read that email at my desk, my vision blurring with rage and exhaustion. Exceptional leadership. The man hadn't written a single line of code. He'd barely understood the technical briefings I'd prepared for him. And now the CEO was praising him as if he'd invented electricity. That night, I updated my archive with the CEO's email, the platform documentation, and a complete record of every contribution I'd made to the project. My sister had been right. The evidence was mounting, but I still didn't know how to use it. The turning point came 6 months before the promotion meeting, when I received an unexpected message from a woman named Priya Ramachandran. She'd worked at Meridian 3 years before I joined and had left under circumstances she described as complicated. She'd seen my name on a patent application that Graham had filed, listing himself as the sole inventor, and she'd reached out because she recognized the pattern. "I went through exactly what you're going through," Priya wrote. "Graham stole 2 years of my research and presented it as his own. When I tried to confront him, he had me pushed out of the company. I thought I was alone. I thought no one would believe me." We met for coffee that weekend, and Priya told me her story. It was almost identical to mine. The charming mentorship, the systematic erasure, the HR complaints that appeared out of nowhere, the gradual destruction of her professional reputation. She'd eventually been forced to resign after Graham convinced leadership that she was difficult to work with. The experience had nearly ended her career. She'd spent a year in therapy, working through the psychological damage of having her contributions stolen and her credibility destroyed. She now worked at a competitor company, where she'd rebuilt her reputation through sheer determination. Before we parted ways, she gave me 2 pieces of advice that would prove invaluable. The first piece of advice was a name. "There's a woman named Dr. Beatrice Okafor," Priya told me. "She's an organizational psychologist who specializes in workplace dynamics and has served as an expert witness in corporate fraud cases. If you ever need someone to help make sense of your documentation and present it to leadership, she's the person." I wrote down the name and filed it away. The second piece of advice was simpler but more important. "Don't let him know you're coming," Priya said. "Graham is a survivor. He's spent decades building relationships and manipulating perceptions. If he knows you're planning to expose him, he'll destroy you before you get the chance. You need to catch him completely off guard, in a setting where he can't spin his way out." I thought about that advice constantly over the following months. I needed the perfect moment, a public setting, an audience of people who mattered, a question that couldn't be deflected or explained away. And then, like a gift from the universe, the promotion opportunity arrived. Meridian announced in January that they were creating a new vice president of data science position, and Graham was the presumptive favorite. He'd been lobbying for the role for years, and his carefully cultivated reputation made him the obvious choice. The interview process would culminate in a final presentation to the executive leadership team, where each candidate would present their most significant recent contribution and answer questions from the assembled executives. When I saw the announcement, I felt something click into place. This was it. This was the moment. Graham would undoubtedly present the pricing optimization platform as his masterpiece. He'd stand in front of 11 executives and take credit for work he'd never done. And when he did, I would be ready. I spent the next 3 months preparing. I compiled every piece of evidence from my archive into a comprehensive document. I hired Dr. Beatrice Okafor, paying her fee from my own savings, and she helped me organize the material into an irrefutable timeline. I obtained records of file creation dates, email metadata, and version control histories that proved beyond any doubt who had actually done the work. I even tracked down 2 former contractors who had worked on the pricing platform and could confirm that they'd reported directly to me. The week before the presentation, I submitted a request to attend as an observer. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. Junior employees were sometimes invited to high-level meetings for developmental purposes. I framed it as a learning opportunity, and my request was approved. I don't think Graham even knew I would be there. He was too busy practicing his presentation, polishing his slides, and imagining the title that would soon precede his name. The morning of the meeting, I woke up at 5 a.m. and couldn't fall back asleep. My stomach was a knot of anxiety and anticipation. I went for a run, showered, and put on the sharpest outfit I owned. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. I'd spent 3 years being invisible. Today, that would change. I arrived at the office an hour early and took my seat in the back corner of the conference room. I watched the executives file in one by one. Lorraine Hu, VP of Operations. Winston Aldridge, CEO. Dr. James Thornton, Chief Technology Officer. Rebecca Lee, General Counsel. 11 people who controlled the future of this company. 11 people who had no idea what they were about to witness. Graham entered the room at exactly 9 a.m., exuding the easy confidence of a man who believed his victory was assured. He was wearing a new suit, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He smiled at the executives, made a joke about the weather, and launched into his presentation with practiced smoothness. I sat in my corner, my hands folded in my lap, and waited. He spent the first 10 minutes on background, establishing context and setting expectations. He talked about the competitive landscape, the need for pricing innovation, and the strategic importance of data-driven decision-making. It was generic corporate speak, designed to fill time without saying anything substantive. And then he clicked to slide 14, and my heart began to race. "This is the pricing optimization platform I developed over the past 18 months, Graham said, gesturing at the screen. "The core innovation is an ensemble machine learning approach that combines multiple predictive models to achieve accuracy rates we've never seen before. My ensemble approach, my innovation, my 18 months of sleepless nights." Graham continued for another 15 minutes, explaining the architecture, the methodology, and the results. He used terms I recognized from my own documentation. He described processes I had invented. He pointed to charts I had created. Every word that came out of his mouth was a theft in real time, performed in front of the most powerful people in the company. When he finished, Winston Aldridge nodded approvingly. Impressive work, Graham. Really impressive. Do we have any questions from the team? Several executives raised their hands. They asked about implementation timelines, scalability concerns, and integration with existing systems. Graham handled each question smoothly, relying on vague generalities and strategic deflection. He was skilled at appearing knowledgeable while saying nothing of substance. And then there was a lull. The executives had exhausted their questions. Winston was about to move to the next agenda item. This was my moment. I raised my hand. I have a question, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, and I felt 11 pairs of eyes turn in my direction. Graham looked up, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. Mira, he said, his smile tightening slightly. Of course. What's your question? I stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch. I'd rehearsed this moment 100 times, but nothing could have prepared me for how it actually felt. My heart was pounding, my palms were slick with sweat, but my voice, when I spoke, was calm and clear. The ensemble approach you described uses a weighted averaging method to combine the outputs of the individual models, I said. Can you explain how you determine the optimal weights? Specifically, I'm interested in the cross-validation strategy you used and why you chose a temporal split rather than a random split for the validation sets. The question was technical, but not impossibly complex. Any data scientist who had actually built the system would have been able to answer it in their sleep. It was a fundamental design decision that shaped the entire architecture of the platform. Graham's smile froze. His mouth opened, then closed. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. The silence in that conference room was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. 11 executives sat motionless, their attention fixed on Graham, waiting for an answer that wasn't coming. I watched his face cycle through a dozen emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, fear, calculation, desperation. He was searching for a way out, a clever deflection, a plausible excuse. But there was no escape. The question was too specific. The audience was too sophisticated, and he had nothing to say because he had never done the work. That's a technical implementation detail, Graham finally stammered. I worked with the team on the strategic direction, but the specific calibration parameters were handled by the analysts. His voice cracked on the last word, and I saw Dr. James Thornton, the chief technology officer, narrow his eyes. Thornton had a PhD in computer science from MIT and had spent 20 years in the industry. He knew evasion when he heard it. Graham, Thornton said, his voice mild but pointed. You just spent 30 minutes presenting this as your own work. Are you saying you don't understand the core methodology? The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Graham's face had gone from confident to ashen in a matter of seconds. He opened his mouth to respond, but I spoke first. If I may, I said, stepping forward, I can explain the methodology since I'm the one who developed it. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder I'd prepared weeks earlier. It contained time-stamped documentation, file metadata reports, email records, and a detailed technical specification that bore my name on every page. I walked to the front of the room and handed the folder to Rebecca Lee, the general counsel. This documentation shows the complete development history of the pricing optimization platform, I said. Every file was created on my computer, under my user account, months before Graham claimed any involvement. The email records show that I submitted regular progress reports to Graham, who then presented my work to leadership as his own. Rebecca Lee opened the folder and began scanning the contents. Her expression shifted from confusion to concern to something much colder. She passed several pages to Winston Aldridge, who stared at them in disbelief. Graham made one last desperate attempt. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising. Mira is a junior analyst. She's been having performance issues. HR has documentation of concerns about her collaborative abilities. She's clearly trying to undermine me out of jealousy or resentment or... He was sputtering now, his polished veneer completely shattered. But I was ready for this, too. The HR complaints were filed by Graham 2 days after I requested to present my own work, I said calmly. I have the timestamps. I also have written testimony from Priya Ramachandran, a former employee who experienced an identical pattern of behavior. And I have a report from Dr. Beatrice Okafor, an organizational psychologist who has reviewed my documentation and concluded that it represents a clear pattern of systematic intellectual property theft. I handed Rebecca Lee a second folder. This one contained Priya's written statement, Dr. Okafor's expert analysis, and the testimony from the 2 contractors who had confirmed my role on the project. Rebecca's face had gone completely still. She was a lawyer. She understood immediately what she was looking at. Winston, she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the documents, I think we need to adjourn this meeting and convene an emergency review with legal and HR. The next several hours were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and urgent consultations. I was escorted to a conference room on a different floor and asked to wait while the executives conferred. I sat alone in that room for what felt like an eternity. my adrenaline slowly fading into exhaustion. I'd done it. I'd actually done it. After 3 years of systematic abuse, I'd finally exposed the truth. But the victory felt hollow. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion, I felt something like grief. Not for Graham, but for the years I'd lost, the confidence he'd stolen, the opportunities that had been diverted to him when they should have been mine. Around 4 p.m., Rebecca Lee came to collect me. She brought me to Winston Aldridge's office, where the CEO was waiting with Dr. James Thornton and Lorraine Hu. They looked shell-shocked. "Mira," Winston said, gesturing for me to sit, "we've reviewed your documentation, and we've initiated a forensic analysis of the file systems, which has confirmed that you are, in fact, the primary contributor to the projects Graham presented as his own." He paused, rubbing his temples. "This is one of the most significant cases of intellectual property misappropriation I've seen in my 35 years in this industry." The investigation that followed was thorough and devastating. The company retained an outside law firm to conduct an independent review. They interviewed current and former employees, analyzed years of documentation, and built a comprehensive picture of Graham's systematic theft. The findings were damning. Over a 12-year career at Meridian, Graham had claimed credit for work produced by at least 14 different junior employees. He had manipulated performance reviews, filed false HR complaints against anyone who challenged him, and cultivated relationships with executives who protected him from scrutiny. The total value of the projects he'd stolen was estimated at over $50 million in revenue contributions. When the investigation concluded, Graham was terminated for cause. The company revoked his unvested stock options, clawed back 2 years of bonuses, and referred the matter to external counsel for potential civil litigation. His name was removed from 3 patents that had been filed under false pretenses. The industry publication that had profiled him as an innovative leader published a retraction. Within 6 months, Graham Whitfield's career was effectively over. He tried to find work at other companies, but word had spread. No one wanted to hire the man who had been exposed as a fraud in front of an entire executive team. The aftermath for me was complicated. On one hand, I received recognition I'd been denied for years. Dr. James Thornton personally apologized for not noticing the pattern sooner and recommended me for an accelerated promotion track. I was given credit for my contributions, a substantial equity grant to compensate for years of stolen bonuses, and my choice of projects going forward. Within a year, I was promoted to Director of Data Science, the role Graham had been pursuing when his career imploded. But recognition couldn't undo the damage. I spent months in therapy, working through the psychological impact of years of gaslighting and professional abuse. There were nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced that I'd made the whole thing up, that Graham had been right and I was just a jealous junior employee with delusions of competence. Imposter syndrome didn't begin to cover it. Even with vindication in hand, part of me still doubted my own worth. That's the thing about this kind of abuse. The external victory is only half the battle. The internal work takes much longer. It's been 2 years since the promotion meeting that ended Graham's career. I'm now a vice president at Meridian, leading a team of 40 data scientists and analysts. I've instituted new policies around attribution and credit that make it much harder for anyone to repeat what Graham did. Every project has clear documentation of contributions. Every presentation includes the names of everyone who worked on it. No one gets to claim sole credit for collaborative work. I've also become an informal mentor for junior employees who feel like their contributions are being overlooked. Several have come to me with concerns about their managers, and in each case, I've helped them document their work and advocate for themselves. Not every situation involves malicious theft. Sometimes it's just thoughtlessness or poor communication. But when it's something more, when there's a pattern of systematic exploitation, I make sure the right people know about it. I've learned that staying silent protects the wrong people. Last month, I ran into Douglas Park, the HR representative who had delivered Graham's fabricated concerns about my collaborative abilities. He'd been promoted twice since then, and he clearly didn't expect to see me. When our eyes met in the elevator, he looked away quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. My presence was enough. I'd outlasted him, outranked him, and proven that every concern he'd documented was a lie manufactured by a man who had been systematically defrauding the company. Some victories don't require words. The question I asked in that conference room was simple. It was technical but not esoteric. Any competent data scientist would have been able to answer it. But Graham couldn't, because he had never been competent. He had been a parasite, feeding on the work of others while projecting an image of brilliance. And in the end, all it took was one question to reveal the truth. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't raised my hand that day. Graham would have gotten his promotion. He would have continued stealing credit for years, maybe decades. More junior employees would have been exploited and discarded. The pattern would have continued indefinitely, protected by charm and relationships and institutional inertia. But I did raise my hand, and everything changed. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.